If you look at the business cycle, you can see the different points of the business cycle. One is an increasing, or we call this an expansionary phase of the economy. Number two is falling on the business cycle. This would be called a contractionary phase of the business cycle. You also have periods of at where the economy maxes itself out and bottoms itself out, which would be the peak and the trough, respectively. Only when the rate of growth of GDP falls below zero does GDP actually shrink. And you can see the rate of GDP growth is positive throughout this entire graph, based on the information that you have. Let's look now at the different portions of the business cycle and see what correct names of these portions are. Again, we were just talking about the business cycle, and you can see that we have the peak, or expansionary cycles. You can see this. There's also the what we call the contractionary cycle portion of the business cycle. Let's take a look at some real GDP data. Growth in real GDP, as you can see here, as measured on these axes, you have time continuum, not only measured in year, but measured in the quarter of each year. As you see, quarter one, quarter two, quarter three, quarter four of these different time periods. And notice that the GDP is constantly changing. It's up and down, up and down, up and down. This is from 1980 to 2006. What you'll also notice is that even though there are expansions, contractions, peaks, booms, and troughs in these business cycles, that even with all of these ups and downs in the short run, the trend for the real gross domestic product in the long run is what is most important. So in the short run, you're going to see jumps up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down, maybe very extreme. In the long run, that's what we're worried about most. And as you can see, when you look in the long run, you can actually see the trend line from 1980 to 2006. What do you notice about the trend line from 1980 to 2006? Though it jumps up and down, you got it. It's a constant increase. It's increasing. It's not increasing at a very fast rate, but it's increasing over time from 1980 to 2006. Notice the trend in the long run has that upward slope. Obviously, for growth, it's much better than a downward sloping trend. Real GDP in the 3% range is considered to be a rate of growth that doesn't cause too much added pressure on the price level. So that's what countries are trying to get. They're trying to get at or above 3% growth. This other thing that we need to understand about GDP is GDP in current and constant, or what is called chained dollars. You notice here the difference between these two curves. GDP in current dollars is measured in green, and in constant dollars is measured in blue. In current dollars, it just means that it's based on the value of the dollar amount during that particular year in which it's being measured. For example, value of current GDP in 06 was $13,487 billion, or $13.4 trillion, approximately. You can see that on the green line. Current dollars is called nominal GDP, and you're going to see these two terms, nominal GDP and real GDP. Most economists would use real GDP as their method of accounting, as the most accurate method of accounting in most situations. More important is that than the current or nominal is the real GDP. This is listed in constant or chained dollars, which you find in the blue on the same graph. When you look at it, you get a better comparison of GDP from year to year without inflation. Nominal GDP includes inflation because it includes current dollars, while real GDP has constant dollars that are not changed by the inflationary process, which is a natural process over time. The value of real GDP in this year, the latest year on this chart, was $11.5 trillion, whereas the nominal GDP for the same year was rated as $13.4 trillion. So real GDP is actually a better measure of what really is going on in the economy. You can also look in the base year, 2000 is the base year. Real GDP and nominal GDP was $9.8 trillion. Notice on the graph, by comparing real GDP relative to the base year, you get a better idea of what's happening with GDP. This is a better method than looking at nominal because that GDP includes an inflationary rate, as stated before. There's also another measure that is related to GDP, which is called the GDP deflator, also known as the implicit price deflator. When we're taking a look at GDP, deflator is used to figure out real GDP when given nominal GDP. So it's a formula, okay, for the GDP. It's relatively easy. GDP deflator is equal to the nominal GDP divided by the real GDP multiplied by 100. If you're given the figure for GDP deflator and you know the current or nominal GDP and you want to figure out real GDP, then all you have to do is use the next formula, which is real GDP equal to nominal GDP divided by the GDP deflator. You're just manipulating the equation to get to the answer that you want. Again, multiply by 100 to get those. So just a couple of formulas that will help you out. If you wanted to come back to this, you could actually look at this, and I'll make sure that the link is available for you to come back to this page and do some practice on it yourself. We're actually going to skip very quickly through the next page because it gives you the answers, and I want you to just play around with it to see what you get. Right? What's the formula for real GDP? We've been talking about what GDP is, and we talked about how real GDP is important in the calculation. Well, this is economics, so guess what? You're going to have a formula. Number one, national income equals real GDP. National income is income earned from the factors of production. It is equal to real GDP, the purchase of current goods and services. In other words, income earned from factors of production that produce goods and services is equal to the purchasing of these goods and services. Once you understand this concept of the volume of goods and services produced, you have some idea of how many goods and services are available for consumers, how many are available as inventory for business growth, how many goods and services and capital goods are available to the government, how many goods and services are available for export. Again, national income is income earned from the factors of production. It is real GDP, the purchase of current goods and services. Real GDP is equal to C, consumption, plus I, investment, plus G, government purchases or government spending in a closed economy, plus exports minus imports. Also known, X minus M in parentheses, is known as net exports in an open economy. Change in any of these components, C, I, G, X, or M, is a change in the flow of real GDP, which in turn increases the stock of real GDP, as we stated earlier. Going back to the bathtub simulation, when any of these components of real GDP increases or decreases, causes the flow to increase or decrease, which causes the stock, that real GDP, to rise or fall. It's very, very simple idea. So if consumption rises, and government spending is on the rise, and we are finding out that investment is growing, even though net exports may be negative and are flowing out of the economy, you can see in the tub we still got quite a bit of stock GDP that we've created from this increase in consumption, investment, and government spending. It's not always going to be that cut and dry, but it gives you an idea of where all this stuff comes from to calculate the gross domestic product. Let's see, value of components. Let's see. Now, in 2006, if you want to break down the value, and this is where we're going to get to a more